Thank you very much for the kind words, and I wish to welcome everybody to my presentation. But before delving into the topic, I would like to thank JAMS for the very kind invitation and for this fascinating seminar. Next slide, please. Well, as you know, in the span of only 5 years, autonomous ships have turned from a non-issue to, I would say, the main regulatory project of the IMO. And as we have heard in May 2022, the IMO's efforts to integrate this new type of ship into its legal framework culminated in the decision to develop one or several mass codes, which are supposed to fill in the gaps that have been identified by the regulatory scoping exercise conducted by the IMO between 2018 and 2021. Importantly, the legal committee concluded during the regulatory scoping exercise that there is currently no need to discuss the 4 SUA conventions. As a result, the only treaties of the IMO that squarely address maritime security and law enforcement at sea will not be directly considered in the work relating to the mass code. However, in the mass code, a series of transversal issues will be addressed even as a matter of priority. And here, I guess, maritime law enforcement and thus also Coastguard functions come in. In my view, decisions in relation to these transversal issues have rather far-reaching implications on how law enforcement operations at sea will be conducted and how effective they can be. So why should that be the case? Next slide, please. Well, to find the answer, let us look at the list of transversal issues that were identified during the regulatory scoping exercise and have already been highlighted this morning in the keynote speech. We have the definition of mass, but we have also the determination of the role, responsibilities, and qualification of the master and crew, the meaning of the concept of remote operation centers and the role, responsibility, and qualifications of the remote operator, as well as their place of operations. And last but not least, we also have the transversal issues pertaining to the form, use, and presentation of certificates by mass. Decisions in relation to these transversal issues will determine what a mass is and thus also determine what the object of law enforcement at sea is. That's the reason why these transversal issues really matter for law enforcement and thus certain Coastguard functions. So far, none of these transversal issues has been finally settled. Rather, for each transversal issues, a series of regulatory options are tabled, and thereby it's not always clear which options are permissible under existing international law and which options can arguably not be accommodated by existing law. Next slide, please. So why is there uncertainty as regards to the question whether certain options are covered by existing law or rather not? Well, that has to do with the assumptions underlying the rules pertaining to law enforcement at sea, and that has already been mentioned by the previous speaker. We have the assumption that the perpetrator of a crime at sea is on board the offender ship. We have also the assumption that there is a human interaction at sea, allowing for a direct communication between enforcers and suspects, and also for an exchange of physical documents proving facts, such as the nationality of the ship or the cargo on board. With mass of autonomy degree 3 and 4, that is mass without onboard crew, these assumptions simply are no longer met. So this begs the question whether rules are still applicable and what they mean in the context of offender ships without onboard crew. And the answer to this question is important when discussing options on how to regulate the transversal issues I was mentioning before. So give me some examples by walking you through the various steps of a law enforcement operation at sea. Next slide, please. Well, the first step of a gradual law enforcement response usually consists in hailing, ordering to stop or warning the ship. However, for mass without onboard crew, it's not clear how this is done. Historically, ships were hailed by waving flags or using megaphones. Later, other technologies were developed, such as radio communication. And to warn a ship, enforcers can also fire a shot across the bow. However, if there is no one on board the ship who can see or hear a message or who can be impressed by a warning shot, other means and channels must be used to convey the order to stop. Next slide, please. However, with mass, it's not simply about using new means or channels. It's not simply about how a ship is hailed, warned, or stopped. Rather, mass involves new actors, such as remote operators, maybe even acting from onshore. And they involve a new allocation of tasks, and this affects with whom enforcers interact. In a traditional setting, it's quite plain who the primary interlocutor of enforcers is. It's the master who is in charge on board the vessel, including for queries of law enforcement officials or authorities. With mass, however, it's not yet clear who the interlocutor of enforcers is, and the answer depends on how a series of rather principled questions will be answered, such as who will perform the role and functions traditionally incumbent on the master if the vessel subject to enforcement action is without onboard crew? Will functions traditionally allocated to one single person, the master, be split and attributed to different types of actors? And if so, who is the interlocutor of enforcers? And could a legal rather than a natural person bear the ultimate responsibility for carrying out specific functions? And if so, we would arguably still need a natural person serving as the interlocutor of enforcers. And suppose there is a residual crew on board the offender ship. In that case, further questions arise, such as can the residual crew only be the interlocutor if they have, next to shore-based actors, a major actual potential role in the vessel's control or operation, for instance, in case of system failure, or also if they have just a minor role and are not really meant to be ever in charge of that ship. Already at this stage, it becomes clear that determining the meaning, role, and responsibilities of master, crew, and remote operators is crucial to understand who is in charge of a mass and with whom law enforcement officials would communicate and interact. And as the envisaged mass code is supposed to clarify a series of these questions, it's very relevant for enforcement activity too. Next slide, please. Another transversal issue pertains to certificates that mass are supposed to carry, including how they could be requested or produced if no seafarer is aboard, and what format they could take. And this is also a rather relevant issue for law enforcement, namely for visit and search of a boat. As regards visit and search, its rules are also based on certain assumptions. Most importantly, the drafters of boarding provisions assumed that the determination of the nationality and any further examination of the suspect ship, such as the search of the cargo, take place on board that ship. That means that a physical boarding of the ship takes place. There is also the presumption that facts are established through a human interaction and through the exchange of physical documents, such as the certificate of registry or the bill of lading. With mass, these two assumptions are no longer fulfilled. As regards to physical boarding, there are, first of all, a series of operational concerns or problems. There is no master who could maneuver the suspect ship to accommodate the physical boarding and who could present documents and answer questions. And there are also security concerns. If you board a ship without onboard crew, how could you ensure that the suspect ship does not sail off together with the boarding team? As regards certificates, mass will in all likelihood not carry physical, but rather e-certificates. And taken together, this begs the question whether in case of a mass, it would be permissible to virtually visit and search a ship. That means to determine nationality and cargo of a ship through accessing e-certificates rather than by going on board. Well, various boarding provisions explicitly refer to visit and search taking place on board the ship. Next slide, please. However, in my view, these provisions could be interpreted broadly to also cover a virtual visit. However, only if the safeguards that must be respected in the course of a physical boarding can also be respected in case of a virtual boarding. This, first of all, means that access to the respective e-certificates is only granted if there are reasonable grounds to believe that a mass engages in crimes at sea. Further, that in the course of a virtual visit, no other information than the one that could be retrieved through a physical boarding of the ship is obtained. Finally, for a physical boarding, the law provides that only authorized law enforcement vessels and officials engage in visit and search, and that the master and crew of the suspect ship can verify this. To ensure this, statecraft engaged in enforcement measures must be clearly marked, the officials must be uniformed, and they must provide government-issued identification documents for examination by the master. In the context of mass without onboard crew, there's, however, no one on board who could see markings or who could see uniforms or check IDs, and it's not yet clear what the functional equivalent could be, how enforcers could identify themselves vis-a-vis systems granting access to e-certificates. In sum, if all these safeguards are respected, a virtual visit is arguably less intrusive than a physical visit, notably as a virtual visit would usually not cause a delay of a ship's journey. As the mass code is likely to address the issue of certificates and how and by whom and under what conditions they could be requested, this mass code may bring some clarity as regards virtual visit and search. Next slide, please. A further transversal issue covered by the discussion of an IMO mass code are remote operation centers. From a law enforcement perspective, there is one very important issue arising in this context, namely whether the remote operator, or more broadly speaking, the person in charge of the mass must be located in the flag state, or whether it would be allowed that the remote operator operates the mass from a third state. In my view, the remote operator should operate from the territory of the flag state. This is not only required under the law of the sea, but also necessary for effectively suppressing maritime crime. Imagine a traditional vessel is used to transport unlawful cargo, such as weapons or drugs or sanctioned goods, alongside lawful cargo. If stopped at sea, the patrolling naval state could question the suspect and arrest him or her if suspicion hardens. If, however, the offender uses a mass, the patrolling naval state cannot arrest a person as there is simply no person on board. And the arrest could only be obtained through the authorities of the flag state, which are on shore. The flag state, however, can only carry out an arrest of a remote operator if the remote operator is in its own territory, because enforcement jurisdiction is limited to a state's own territory. A flag state could not arrest a remote operator controlling its ships from a third state. So if the bridge is taken ashore, the flag state can only take those enforcement measures which the patrolling naval states cannot take because the offender is not at sea, if the operation center and the remote operator are indeed located on its territory and operate from there. If, by contrast, the flag state is only the place of incorporation of a shell company and the actual operations of a mass are carried out from the territory of a third state, the flag state has little means to enforce the law against persons committing crimes involving ships flying its flag. That the remote operator is located in the territory of the flag state is, in my view, required by the UNCLOS, because the assumption in the UNCLOS is that the flag state exercises jurisdiction over both the movable property ship, but also the master. And many provisions of UNCLOS do not explicitly state this, as it was simply a truism so far that the offender would be on board the ship. Next slide, please. However, there are provisions of the UNCLOS explicitly stating the idea, for example, Article 94 UNCLOS. The provision reads, every state shall effectively exercise its jurisdiction over ships flying its flag. And Article 94(2)b goes on to specify, in particular, every state shall assume jurisdiction under its internal law over ships flying its flag and its master. So the flag state must have jurisdiction over both the movable property and the person on board. If the remote operation center and the remote operator is not operating from the territory of the flag state cannot exercise enforcement jurisdiction over both ship and master, and in my view would thus violate Article 94, and a certain enforcement gap would arise. In current discussions, views diverge as to whether the remote operator should be required to operate from the territory of the flag state or whether the remote operator could sit anywhere in the world. In my view, as mentioned, UNCLOS requires that the remote operator is located in flag state and not in a third state, which is potentially completely disinterested in enforcing the law against remote operators breaching the law. MAS provide criminals with a cutting edge from a factual point of view. And if we do not require remote operators to operate from the territory of the flag state, we would create, in addition, legal conditions furthering impunity. Effective prevention and repression of crimes committed by MAS requires that the remote operator has its seat and real operations in the flag state. Last slide, please. So let me conclude. The planned IMO MAS code does not directly address law enforcement at sea or Coast Guard functions, and yet, as demonstrated, the transversal issues discussed in the context of this MAS code are highly relevant for maritime law enforcement, essentially because these transversal issues will help us understand what the object of enforcement measures is. To come back to the title of my presentation, the IMO work on MAS is indeed very relevant for law enforcement at sea, even if this link with Coast Guard functions is arguably not immediately apparent. It is thus very important that the perspective of the Coast Guard and actors tasked with law enforcement at sea are integrated in the current discussions, and that's why this seminar is of huge importance. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor, for pointing out a lot of important things that the Coast Guard functional organizations must face in the real world. Thank you very much. Because of the time, I think I can pick up only one question, either from the online or from the floor. If anybody, or may I take this opportunity to take the question previously raised by, I think that was Mr. Stevens from ICS, to direct it to the commander. Are you ready to answer to the question? Okay, yes, please.
Yes, good morning. It was for Commander Joe. It was just a thought process regarding search and rescue, which is based upon safety of life at sea. And if an unmanned vessel was in distress, but there was no crew on board, would there be an obligation of the Coast Guard to assist, or would it end up as a salvage or even a wreck situation? Is that kind of a bloodline? So I was just looking for your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I don't know if this is back on. Yes. Thanks for the question. I mean, I think generally speaking, the duty attaches for the rescue of persons. Rescue of property would be a separate analysis, and I would say a lesser obligation. Certainly, if there was an opportunity to divert and easily prevent it from sinking, I think most mariners would. But if it was clear that there was no one aboard, I don't know at that point that you would have a diversion. I guess I'd have to do some more thinking, but I would say in general, the duty assist under international law is specific to persons rather than property. Great question.
Okay, thank you for the Q&A. But then once again, any question to the presentation by Dr. Patrick? Yes, please, but very briefly, please. Microphone, please, to the very front row.
Thank you. It's basically the same question. I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Ernest Frøseth. I'm electronics engineer, but also leading the work in ISO and vocabulary for mass. And I agree with Commander Guido. Technically, full autonomy is very difficult. But I think also from a legal point of view, that this idea of full autonomy is extremely difficult, because your point is that you have to have a responsible person. And if you have a responsible person, the system is not fully autonomous. So I think this comes back to the terminology, that we have to be very careful about how we term stuff.
Yes, I fully agree that right now we have an oversimplification of definitions, usually similar to other systems. You have not a ship which is fully autonomous or fully remote control. It's rather specific functions. And I guess some functions could be fully autonomous, where other functions you would still have a human in the loop. So I guess we have to look at different functions of a ship and not a ship as a whole. And I guess that's also something which is covered in the discussions, or will be covered in the discussions in relation to a mass code, the definitions, because for the regulatory scoping exercise, we have these 4 categories which are not really reflecting the realities, also not reflecting the idea that maybe the ship can switch between degrees of autonomy. It's a different scenario whether you're on the high seas with little traffic, comparatively speaking, or in a congested harbor, or in a narrow strait with a lot of traffic. So I guess right now we have a very simple categorization, and as the discussion progresses, we need maybe to revise these categories and to think in more complex terms.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I see a few online questions, but I apologize for not being able to catch up any with those. But I believe these online questions can be dealt with properly at some point later stage. May I ask the Secretary if it is the case?
Thank you very much. So you do have the coffee break session. So 10 minutes. So we will resume the session at 12:25. Thank you very much.
Yes, the point I'm trying to make is that the online questions can be handled later at some point, because I think the speakers are pleased to respond to the online questions if the secretariat allows us to do so.
Yes, please. Yes. So maybe we can do that in the Q&A session, please.
Yes, thank you very much. The 15 minutes break, I think will be 10 minutes break. Thank you.